Hey, welcome to the Pacifism and Strategy Games Roundtable for TactiCon, put on by TactiCon.games, Fire Squid, and Hooded Horse. I'm Seth, and we're going to jump right into the introductions.
Hey, I'm Shen. I'm a community manager at Log.
Hi,
League of
I'm
Geeks,
Mario.
I should probably say.
Hi, Mario. I'm a game developer working on the game Rogue Command for almost 4 years now.
I'm Seth. I run the Strategy Informer, which is a place to find out about good strategy games. I guess my experience with lots of games is why I'm going to be hosting this panel, and hopefully it won't be a disaster. So we wanted to talk about pacifism in strategy games. Why don't we start out with why it's not done and why is war so prevalent in the strategy game market, genre? I know, Mario, you had some ideas on that, so let's start out there and see what happens.
Yeah, for sure. So I think if you talk about pacifism in general, it's a very it's an idea about social movements mostly, and I think in a lot of strategy games, and especially like going back, it's a lot easier to kind of simulate. Hey, this has dealt such and so many points of damage to something else, compared to kind of simulating the goings-ons of kind of a social dynamic that where kind of organizing a pacifist movement would be something that would actually have an impact on a game. I think that is one of the really hard things when I think about how to have an actual pacifist game. I think it's a very different thing. Of course, there's a lot of peaceful games, cozy games that is a very different, or not very different, but that's kind of a bit of a different problem. And there's of course a lot of things, especially in the last couple of years. I think there's been really cool stuff coming out, and it's been kind of a wave of that coming.
I also think it's kind of like war games and games that involve battle are always a lot more like visceral. Like they always have a lot of action. There's a lot of like serotonin. There's a lot of like, good feedback in the feedback loop that happens almost immediately from when, you see you're going to war with someone and then having this like very clear-cut victory. Whereas I think so far in exploring strategy games, we haven't really ventured past the point of, pacifism as this kind of subliminal force that happens in the background, and it's just like an inaction. Whereas I think a lot of people in games want to do something, right? They want to conquer something, they want to explore something, they want to come out on top, basically. I think that's where a lot of games are focused, and so I think it's easy to create games like that.
Yeah,
maybe even lazy.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think it's kind of telling, like when people talk about game feel. Like a lot of what that connotates is kind of screen shake, cool explosions, big bullets, and stuff. And I'm definitely like the game that we're working on. It like that is definitely something that is such an easy win, right? If you just like make the explosions bigger, make it brighter, that kind of stuff.
Cooler VFX.
Yeah,
and it's super fun. Like it's very, very fun to make. It's very fun to play as well. I think there's a very basal, satisfactory component to that.
Yeah, it's like primal, right? It's just
I had an interesting experience with the game that I work on, Terminal Conflict, which is a Cold War game. Obviously, it's conflict. The Ukraine war happened, and I felt bad about having a game that was based on war when people were dying. And I think there's this prevalence in some strategy games, obviously not in wargaming, but in some strategy games, we're seeing stuff like the peaceful city builders, tile placement, worker placement games coming to the PC, bleeding off of the board game industry. So you've got like Dwarf Romantic and the thousands of clones that it generated. And some of them are really good, but if you're playing for score, it's not as interactive, visceral. Was the term you used, Trent? It's not as
Yeah.
visceral to just be playing for the score. And if it's a multiplayer game, you're kind of just playing solitaire, and the other person's playing with you.
I think like going back to what Mario said on like cozy games is a really interesting thing. I think maybe I'd suggest that the rise of cozy games have happened since kind of pandemic times is when we've seen it really kick off, where people
Yeah,
have had
absolutely.
these really stressful experiences and they've just wanted to go to games not to kill something, not to dominate anyone, not to fight, just literally I want to make a little valley, I want to put some houses down, and then I want to chill out. And I think it's super interesting, right?
I guess probably a lot of those projects were started a bit before that, but I definitely feel like there's definitely a vibe to it. I remember when the pandemic hit, Animal Crossing came out around the same time, and everybody was like super into that because it was sort of kind of the perfect get me out of this game.
Yeah, and even if you think now of like some of the indies that have gotten really popular, especially Australian indies, like Unpacking is a really good example. For those that don't know, it's like you basically are just unpacking boxes in a house, and that's it. And it tells a story about, how people grow and transcend and move through time and their possessions. And then you've got like Heavenly Bodies is another really good example, where it's just you're hanging out with your friend and you're just trying to get jobs done in your spacecraft, and that's it. There's no like, intense need to conquer or dominate, and they're both like strategy games to an extent, right? They both have a certain strategy to them. But I think, some of these more intense 4X strategy, grand strategy, bigger titles could take a lot of learnings from these cozy games and what people like and take that into the fold of like maybe options for pacifism, maybe options for diplomacy, maybe options for like economics, just exploring different ways of which that aren't necessarily aggressive.
The 4X games try to do that in some sense with culture victories or wonders victories or things like that. But most players, the most efficient route to victory is war. Because you steamroll. As you get more powerful, they get weaker. So it's an inherent flaw in the 4X genre that the steamroll happens. And yeah, you can steamroll via diplomatic victory or whatever, but the minute you start being able to outproduce and outscience the opponent, you've kind of got the game locked at some point because it can't keep up unless it cheats. And we don't want cheating AI, do we?
Yeah.
No.
I mean,
go ahead.
In the game that we're working on Solium Infernum, which is, I don't know, it's a very cult classic game. It's been recreated by us, but basically the whole thing revolves around diplomacy. So you're in hell, you're an archfiend, you're a powerful person trying to maneuver your way to the throne, basically to rule. And you'd expect that there'd be a lot of outright like battle legion versus battle legion. But a lot of it is actually like trying to figure out the smartest way in a social dynamic setting of being able to manipulate and engage and use people and kind of facilitate this ascendance to the crown without being, too forward or too backward or too hidden or being like isolated. So a lot of it is specifically catered down to the diplomatic means of achieving victory. And you literally cannot go out and attack another person unless you're in what's called a vendetta. Like you just straight up can't attack another person until you've had that diplomacy. And I think maybe as like a 4X game, maybe that's a solution.
That's certainly part of it. How does the AI handle diplomacy aspects of it?
I think the AI just comes to conclusions based on what the most logical path forward is. And so if they see there's a need for diplomacy, they will engage in diplomacy.
Okay. Because I think that's where the weakness comes in with some of the diplomacy victories in say, Humankind or Galciv. And you'll hear me rail about the AI in strategy games. That's kind of like my catchphrase, is wanting better AI in strategy games. But there's some severe weakness when you start looking at things other than optimizing for war. Now, Soren came up with a great design with Off-World Trading Company, which is an RTS, but it's not about war, but there is conflict, but it's economic conflict. Does that count as a pacifistic game? I mean, wouldn't that just be an abstraction to war?
Yeah, that is actually what I was kind of wondering at, or kind of hinting at with the initial thought as well. Is if it depends on how strong you want to define pacifism, basically, because of course, kind of if you have like a classical economic oppressive system that you're kind of setting up, or if you're kind of outmaneuvering people diplomatically, is that still the way to kind of engage in conflict? And I think pacifism would be even one step beyond that, kind of finding ways to solve problems without engaging in conflict and without outmaneuvering. It would be kind of more constructive solutions, I guess, is what I'd say. And so I don't know, but I think that is what makes it really, really difficult. But I think in general that is what people mean, right? Is if you're not doing outright war, if you're not killing the opponent, then it's pacifist enough for games in general.
Just enough. I like that term. It's pacifist enough. Yeah. I think like in a way, like there's also room for game designers and developers to explore like the repercussions of war, and not in like a sense of like you've crushed this nation. Like what are the real like visceral reactions to what happens in a war-torn country? Like you have a bunch of cultures that are clashing together. You have, you know, this kind of depressed nation that have been just crushed by your forces, and now you're imposing your rule over them. Like, where is, like, you could explore all of this contextually, and that could facilitate a better story, and that could facilitate a lot more than just, you beat them, they're now part of your force, let's keep going. You know what I mean?
I think
there's a lot of room there.
rebellion is an interesting area of see what kind of an expansion of what you were talking about, but you're playing the loser and you're trying to, as peacefully as possible, gain back whatever. Are you familiar with the Robert Heinlein book, Fifth Column?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it, no.
It's basically, them trying to take over from within. And the different methods they use, which, there are, sometimes you got to blow up a building to get the attention. But a lot of times you don't do that. You don't engage in anything like that. In this case, they infiltrated the clergy and caused the clergy to do the overthrow. But there are other ways to do it. And I've never really seen a game that went into detail, say a turn-based game that you plotted out what your agents would do.
It's an interesting like concept, because it is not really as simple as most strategy games make it seem. Like it's not like Leapfrog where you just conquer a nation. It's not like Risk, the board game, where you just take, move. It's a lot of like, setting up supply routes that are stable. It's a lot of like in placing people that are reliable in stations at government, who are like reliable at your level and reliable at a local level. It's like preventing rebellion, like you said. It's like there's a lot of minutia that goes into actually maintaining a country, and like the repercussions emotionally are so taxing on that nation. It's like you can't really expect that generation of people, which will last like another 20 to 30 years, to be fully in allegiance with you. It's just not a realistic thing to expect. And I think the assumption that, these countries are just going to kneel down, let you take all their resources and just, kind of give up is like a little bit lazy.
Yeah. I mean, I think some strategy games try to kind of simulate that, right? I think in Crusader Kings, for example, or in games where kind of culture is another aspect of the kind of the engine running in the background, is where it's kind of harder to, like, it's one thing to take over a country, it's a very different thing to kind of keep them under wraps. But again, that is kind of again thought from the perspective of the aggressor in this case, right? So
exactly.
And I find it interesting because the resistance is only kind of a a passive under the hood thing that is happening in those games. There is no way to kind of keep on playing if you are the one that has been overrun, right? You're
Yeah.
not existing as an entity in that case anymore. So and I think that is actually where kind of an interesting dynamic could be happening, right? Where is that counter pressure coming from? How does it manifest without kind of becoming overt violence or overt resistance even. Even still, like things can crumble because like there's this how do you say when people are kind of super demotivated at their job and they've basically quit inside, but they're still kind of coming to work.
What is it called?
I forgot that there was
got like a special
quitting,
term.
quiet quitting.
Yeah,
Yeah, quiet quitting.
Quiet quitting.
Exactly. Yeah, quiet quitting, and that can also happen, I think, at a hugely impactful cultural level. That is kind of one of the things that Chan I think hinted at, as kind of this emotional impact that where people, if you are in a country where nobody wants to do what you want to do as the party that's kind of running things, it's almost impossible. I think.
Hey, look at that! While we were waiting, or while we were talking, Yuji joined us, and we're gonna jump right back into things. Let me have him introduce himself.
Hi everyone. Sorry about that. Unfashionably late. I'm Yuji. I'm the developer of Mars Tactics. It's a turn-based tactical game set on Mars, where it's a fight between the workers and the company that they work for. Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. We can thank TactiCon for putting this together. So it's interesting. All of us are working on or worked on games that involve heavy amounts of conflict.
Yep.
And here we are talking about pacifism. But
bunch of hypocrites.
I think there's been a change in people's what they want to spend time on the computer with, and I think that's possibly due to COVID, possibly due to the Ukraine invasion. I mean, what do you guys think about that? Let's start with the new one, Yuji.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very timely subject to explore. I think most people in the West have seen this war play out from the non-aggressor side, and seeing the complexities of the logistics and just the actual warfare and how to the politics side of that. And there are a lot of interesting elements that could be explored in a strategy game, but I don't think we really have anything quite like that. Often the game you're in the aggressor seat, because that's the one that kind of makes more sense in terms of narrative, I guess. People want to feel the power fantasy in video games. So off the top of my head, I can't really think of a strategy game where you are the non-aggressor side, where you are defending. I think that's something that maybe us developers should look into, and certainly for the next game jam that I'm into, I'll think about that.
Yeah,
I'll be keeping an eye out.
I have to keep thinking about this War of Mine, because I mean it's not a strategy game, but I think it's one of the few games that really tries to look at the human cost of war, basically, which I think it puts it in a very unique position. And yeah, Seth, you mentioned earlier that you kind of had a sinking feeling once the war started, and I wanted to kind of mirror that, because even though our game is only fairly cute robots blowing up, I definitely still felt that when we saw the war starting, and the joy of generating cool explosions and cool destruction effects suddenly felt very different. Like it has kind of leveled out, I think, by now, because people get used to everything after a while. But it's definitely made me question even that, and also make me think about kind of why is it so much easier to kind of represent that? Why is it so hard, or to represent the other kinds of mechanics? And I think what also, Chan, you mentioned.
No, you go.
You mentioned You mentioned unpacking, and I think that is
Mm.
also really interesting because that is kind of like you said, it's a very, very subtle game in terms of mechanics, right? You do very few things, but they kind of manage to still pack the game feel into those interactions. And I think that is really interesting because I feel like that is kind of something where we have to look as game designers is kind of how can we find inherently satisfying mechanics that kind of put a light on different things, like because just like shooting and blowing things up is just so inherently, like you mentioned before, it's such a visceral and clear cut thing, right? It's very easy to see the cause and effect. It's very easy to see if you did the right thing. And yeah, and in unpacking, you kind of you get that vibe just by putting a spray can on top of a toilet, and
Trophy, yeah.
it feels great because they put so much work into kind of getting all those details right. And yeah,
Well, look at all
Yeah.
the people that are playing Power Wash Simulator, and
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
something there when you've got 160,000 positive reviews. I just pulled that number out of my butt, but it's up there.
Yeah, it's probably not far
People.
off.
I guess the casual thing that we talked about before, that people are opting to.
Is that pacifist or because you're shooting the dirt? Sorry.
Everything's a war game. It's all abstraction.
Yeah.
I think this War of Mine is certainly a strategy game. It's resource management. It's a great game. I loved playing it. I never want to play it again. It's very depressing.
Yeah.
It's the best game I never want to play again.
Yeah, that I felt I actually bounced off of it because of that. It felt a bit too intense at the time, and then I never got back to it. And I think maybe that's also part of the reason, right? Because like if you play a game, maybe it's I don't know. I feel like there's been kind of a while where people got very deep into kind of telling emotional stories and that kind of things, and I felt there has been kind of a bit of a backswing in recent years towards again more systemic things like roguelikes, that kind of thing have been the huge thing in the indie scene. And I wonder if there's kind of a connection there, if that it's emotionally difficult work to engage with that on a deeper level like this. Like, right, this War of Mine was really heavy to play for me. Yeah, so
some games may be more of an experience type thing, and this War of Mine is certainly one of them. There's been some other ones, based on stories from 1941. Attended 1941 is one of them. There's a new narrative one that just came out that's about the refugee crisis. I don't know if I want to play those. I mean, that's some heavy material.
Yeah.
I also think, there's also, it's really hard, I think, from a game design perspective when you're thinking about pacifism to balance this power fantasy and the satisfaction of playing a game and then the real world situation that you're put in. War obviously is a really strong topic, and also civil war, civil unrest, especially in the US. All of this intense capitalistic stuff. I think it's really hard to do all this balancing because you want your game to be relevant and you want it to be important and you want it to have emotional weight, but you want people to play it and have fun while playing it. And so trying to get those mechanics just right is a real challenge.
Yeah.
Like I said, when I mentioned the whole AI thing, I want a strategy game that's going to challenge me. I don't necessarily want the power fantasy unless I earned it. I want to earn every inch. And I come from the board gaming world as well, and also the MMO world. So MMOs were, of course, grindy, and board games are, of course, they're well, at least the war games are very, very challenging when you're playing against someone else. And there are a few interesting games out there that explore something like a Crusader King style of 4X. Alliance of the Sacred Sons, or Second Sons, is a Hooded Horse title basically you are the emperor of a galactic power in decline, and you're trying to keep all your people and vassals in order. And yes, you can use military, but there's that storytelling that comes out of it. And there's another one called Star Dynasties that does something similar, where there's 7 of you and you're trying to deal with the decline of the empire. It's interesting how games come out in packs. Like potion games were the big thing for a little bit. There were like 12 potion games.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah, it's
thinking
interesting.
like, oh, sorry. We always go to speak at the same time. Our brains are like meshed.
Yeah,
I was just thinking, like, Log is also working on a game called Jumplight Odyssey. At the same time, we're working on Solium Infernum, which was what I mentioned before. But in that game, you are kind of on this ship as this invading force has just blown up your planet. So you're the captain of the last surviving people of your entire like world. And so I suppose it's kind of this roguelike game. It has roguelike elements. But I'm just thinking back on what we were saying about like being the non-aggressor, being that person that has the emotional repercussions. It's actually, yeah, really relevant and really interesting. And it kind of links back in with all of the new kind of roguelikes that are popping up, like you said, and all of these kind of interesting games that are exploring different dynamics. Like combat is a part of it, but it's just one part of the many faceted things that you're going to have to manage with a declining dynasty or like a fallen civilization. Like people's hope and happiness is like the core, and then there's obviously like surviving, which is important, but then there's combat over here as well.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that in the games you mentioned, Seth, there's also, again, it's kind of like from the perspective of the power, right? It's kind of how do I keep it together? I would find it really interesting. Like, is there something that kind of explores that other space? Like, where is that counteraction coming from? Like, what are the mechanics of the reaction against oppression, against violence that is happening? Like, I think that would be really, really interesting. I don't have any ideas off the top of my head how you could like put that into a satisfying game mechanic, right? It's really, really difficult. Like maybe something like in Among Us even, right? Because it's kind of like more like a social dynamic kind of thing where you kind of have to kind of do backroom meetings and kind of figure out who can I trust, because I think that would be more like how it would be in real life, right? There's a lot about trust, about social dynamics, and kind of how can you kind of see the very initial threats of kind of a power counter power against violence, against oppression.
Yeah. Well, just to kind of pick up on that, Seth was saying earlier how if you don't have that power fantasy, and especially if you explore a lot of the more depressing and the elements of war where it's not the way Hollywood likes to make it, then it becomes a kind of a drag to play. It becomes a big emotional burden just to start the game up. And I was just thinking, people would like to think of games as art. You have things like BAFTA and a lot of efforts to legitimize games as an art form. And at the same time, developers and publishers don't always take that risk because something like The War of Mine is I think probably a commercial success, but that's kind of unusual. And I think it really falls on us as developers to come up with mechanics to make that perspective fun. I mean, if you looking back at looking at cinema, you have something like Schindler's List, and which I would say is I haven't played this War of Mine, but I know quite a little of it. Like Schindler's List explores a really dark and kind of a difficult subject, and then you have something like Saving Private Ryan, which explores the same historical times and it from a different perspective, and yet you get many different facets of war through both films, and yet the latter, Saving Private Ryan, is much more popular, and it's still I think talked about more, at least I don't know in the circles, my circles, and it's like it's the same subject, and there's just so many different ways to cut it and slice it and design it, and from a game developer's perspective, the idea of managing resources, let's say from a loser's perspective or from the non-aggressor perspective, it's like the core part of strategy, the core part of the decisions that you want to be making as a human. So it's like ripe for a game that explores that perspective. And yet, off the top of our heads, we can't really think of a straight up strategy game, whether it's 4X, RTS, turn-based, that really does that, which I think is a shame. And
I think like
give,
the stakes are also so much higher when you're not in the winning position. Like the resources that you have are like, this is it. Like we're putting everything on this one attack, and if it doesn't go, and in that way, I guess it comes back to the trend of like roguelikes, right?
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah. I would just say exactly the same.
There are a lot of games that explore you're behind, someone else has won. AI Wars is one of them, where you're trying to get to the point where you can defeat the big AI, and you're trying to gather resources behind his back. Sorcerer King is another one like that. But I wanted to loop back to the playing the insurgency. In board games, we have what we call coin games, and that's counterinsurgency, where one player is usually playing the aggressor and the other player is trying to get out of the loop. A good example of this would be one that went to computer called Vietnam 65. It's a hearts and mind game. You go around trying to convince the cities or villages to support you so that the Viet Cong don't swarm you. That's still a conflict game, though, but it's getting closer to having elements of non-warfare.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because you bring that up. Sorry, again. You bring that up and you take like a tiny sidestep, like just a little bit to the side, and then there's Cult of the Lamb, which is, incredibly commercially successful. But obviously the core of it is, I guess, violence, but in a social dynamic setting, in a way that's like, come and join, I need to convince, I need to basically pull people in, right? So it's like interesting how they're so close, we're so close, but we're not on it just yet.
Something like, the one where you make a cult.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Something cult. But it's like a RimWorld-like, and you're building out a cult.
Honey, I started a cult or something.
Thank you.
Or Cult Simulator.
Yeah.
No,
if it's not a game, it needs to be.
A Cult Simulator is a game. We can talk about that. That's an interesting one. It is indeed a strategy game. You play nouns on verbs. So you send this person to work, and time goes, and then you get money. And you explore the game through this paradigm. There is indeed conflict. You play a weapon on something. You try to convince people to join your secret society. Crazy game. Really good. One of my favorites.
Do we consider like things like extremist kind of cult behavior as pacifism? Is that pacifism in a way? Like there's some cults that
behavior isn't.
Extremist behavior obviously isn't. But is like a cult, would you consider that like pacifism?
I mean, it's
I guess so.
It's a social movement, right? That is kind of. But I think it's interesting because on the other hand, you could say that a cult is kind of using people as resources in a way, and I think that is also kind of what you're doing in these kinds of games. Is a bit like. My points are people, and like I'm trying to gather the people, which I think also is something that like pacifist games kind of would have to engage with, right? Because that is where, of course, how real dynamic like that would work. And I think it's really interesting the Vietnam game that you mentioned, because it's kind of pushes into that territory where I just had the question in my mind is, does pacifism necessarily have to be? I mean, yeah, it kind of has to be non-violent, but I feel it's kind of interesting, right? If you're in a situation where where violence is happening against someone, like how do you counter that in a way that's pacifist? And I think that is kind of where my initial ideas was kind of like, you know, the Gandhi movement in India or something like that. Like how would you gamify something like that?
I was just about to ask that. How do you
it's even
gamify
like
Gandhi?
it feels weird. Just sorry, it kind of
You
feels
get
weird
a
even to think about
Gandhi.
it.
I think
think.
he like. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
You go. You go. I
Okay,
insist.
I'll go quickly. I think in the context of a 4X, you know, it doesn't have to be warfare. You could win through economic means, through technological means, through diplomacy. So I think there are a lot of levers we could pull in terms of mechanics for overcoming the aggressor. But if you're talking about a straight up, you know, more of a combat focused game, I'll give you one example that I think we've danced around that we maybe should have tackled, especially given that it's a TactiCon panel. XCOM 2, which flipped the script, and you're no longer. Well, I mean, even the original XCOM, you're also defending, but XCOM 2 especially, you've lost. You're playing from the perspective that humanity lost, and you're trying to fight back in this guerrilla warfare. And I mean, that is very much a combat focused game, but you know, could there have been more diplomatic kind of economic elements where you try to, you know, drum up the people, get support, and slowly overcome the aliens in a different way? That would have been fun to explore. I think that really novel.
XCOM
I would
Apocalypse, I believe, is what it was. Kind of does that, where there's multiple factions. I guess, you know, the biggest example of something like that would be Terra Invicta.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
Was
right there.
intimidated by that.
Very intimidating game. And it's
Yeah.
certainly a game where you can play for 50 hours and lose, which I appreciate, but you have to expose all the information to make it fair to the player. I just looked at Jumplight Odyssey, and it looks great, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice.
And I do
Yeah.
consider that a strategy game. I mean, management is strategy.
It does, yeah. It hits it. It hits on a bunch of things like that. It hits on like being able to build and customize your ship. Hits on resource management. It's a roguelike, so if you get caught, you're kind of busted. It hits on a bunch of like combat elements. It also really hits on a lot of the individualistic crew member things that often are kind of overlooked in those bigger games. Like each person on your ship has a personality. Each of them have needs. Each of them have like feelings and kind of emotions, attachments. If you send someone out on a mission to get more resources and they don't come back, those people are upset. Those people are sad. And it has a hope bar, which is kind of really important to the actual game itself. If you have no hope, you kind of cut away and lose. Yeah, it has a lot of elements to it that I think kind of, again, dance around what we're saying here, which is what are the emotional tolls of being in the losing part of the war. But to kind of stretch what you were saying a little bit, Mario, I think like ultimately, if we bring games all the way back to the core of what they are, it's like a competition in some ways. So it's really interesting because I don't think you could have pacifism as a thing, which is inherently non-confrontational, non-conflict orientated, without conflict. Like there always has to be conflict to have pacifism. Do you think that's true? Do you think maybe there's a game where it's just pacifism?
But there has to be conflict in a game, doesn't there?
Yeah, is it like always so true that we need conflict for there to be pacifism? Can pacifism exist just as an entity?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the way that I should have looked up a definition, I guess, but I definitely feel like pacifism is kind of a reaction towards violence. That's the way that we kind of think about it usually. And there's definitely peaceful games, but that is kind of what I said right at the beginning, is like about the cozy games and that kind of stuff. That is definitely, there is a lot of peaceful games, but I feel like pacifism is more kind of in the social dynamic versus conflict. So I think you're right there, and I think that what you mentioned about the game that you're working on, which the name I just forgot again.
Jumplight, Odyssey. No worries.
Odyssey, is exactly what I said also initially, is kind of, you need those additional system layers of simulation, right? To make that make sense. Like you have emotion, you have hope, you have these kinds of things that are usually kind of obscured or abstracted away in games. I think to make that make sense, you kind of need those. You need those social aspects in a game to have that actually mean something. And I think that is also why I kept thinking about kind of Crusader Kings, because I feel like that is a game that manages to kind of, in its way, even though it can be a very conflict-ridden game, of course, it is a game that is very good at kind of showing those emotional the emotional impacts of these kinds of things, because the characters that are being simulated are fairly complex, and they are interwoven in kind of a real social fabric in their societies. And I think that is something where that kind of makes to like pacifism, how I would interpret it, makes more sense in kind of a game environment that is kind of simulation heavy like that, because otherwise it's just a bit pointless, I think. Yeah. Sorry, I'm trading off.
Let's say we take like humankind, and because it's a 4X and I don't want to take Civ, but Thorin Johnson, who is one of the Civ developers, said that players will min-max the fun out of a game. So if the pacifistic victory is harder than a war victory, they're going to go that way because they want that power fantasy. The percentage of people that want high difficulty games and don't want a power fantasy is small. Is there a market for this?
Yeah, and it's even like I just remembered like a long time ago when I played a Civilization game. I think it was kind of the one that Activision put out. I don't remember the name. It was like an offshoot. Yeah, exactly. I played that fairly pacifistic for almost all the game, and then at the end I nuked everyone. Because and I think that's coming back to what we like the game feel aspect again, because it's kind of, I wanted to see how it looks. I wanted to test the nukes out because they look kind of cool and the explosions are cool. So
we're a bunch of hypocrites.
Yeah, so and I think that is kind of, there was no equivalent game mechanic that would have the same visceral, like, satisfactory impact like nuking all my enemies had at that moment. And I think that is kind of, again, where there's like a really interesting challenge. Like, how can we make that equally as satisfying? How can we find ways to kind of make that impact like really felt? And then we get into the heavy territory again, like make the negative impacts of the actual war that's happening felt even more. Because I think that is also like, that gets, like, there was no impact of those nukes. There was no people, like, I don't know, there was no gruesome scenery there that I had to deal with as a fallout of that.
And if you go to a nuclear war and terminal conflict, we put in a population count of an estimation of the people that died for that very factor. And we did that after the Ukraine war. I think that might have been one of the influencing factors, is we wanted to show that, a nuclear war would be absolutely horrible. And we were just looking at the population of the actual explosions. We weren't looking at, data for food loss and something like that. But showing the horrors of war is certainly not something, in a pacifistic game. Maybe, I don't know. I think if you were going to create one where you start as, you've lost, you're trying to recover, and you try some sort of back end, arrangement on it. I think that's where you go. Or you increase what you can do with diplomatic or economic victories in a 4X. The AI is not strong enough to play those games sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah.
I also think it's really interesting that we've seen this kind of move from some games. Like, I'm just thinking at this massive kind of macro worldly level where you just nuked everybody. I think it's interesting that we've seen some games, like I'm thinking of Plague, Inc. specifically. The satisfaction of seeing those numbers just roll up, you're like, yes, let me infect everyone. Awful mindset, but just some kind of power fantasy there as a virus or a bacteria just spreading around. But they actually released the Cure DLC. I don't know if anybody's seen that,
Yes.
but I think it's really interesting that you can go between these two things and that there's actually like a, hey, this is a proactively peaceful solution to, you trying to be an awful virus. Yeah.
I think maybe we're trying to kind of design this game that doesn't exist, but maybe it doesn't have to be that difficult. Maybe you can just give the player that choice, and they can. Sometimes you don't have a choice in a lot of games. It's designed around combat. Maybe a big part of increasing pacifism with strategy games and other genres is just to give that choice, and actually it kind of makes if you're able to balance the mechanics and the resources and the metagame really well, I think it'll actually empower both options to be violent or non-violent. Just to give you an example from my game, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's just basically think of XCOM, but instead of fighting aliens, you're fighting, your company, or from the company's perspective. You can play as both, the workers, labor versus capital. So it's not a I must kill them all kind of situation. So I added the ability to down enemies is a much bigger aspect, because then you can take a prisoner, you can use them either for intel or I guess put them to work as slaves, I guess, or cheap labor, just to stay on theme with the game. But once I introduced the idea that DBNO, down but not out, that enemies don't have to be completely finished off, it really changed some of my, both of the larger, longer term strategic thinking, as well as the tactical, the mission. What am I really doing? What am I trying to achieve? If I can get a couple more downs rather than kills, I can get a lot of intel out of them that'll really help me out. And maybe just giving a player more options. Games are ultimately a sandbox. Like Mario, you were saying you wanted to nuke just to see what it's like, right? Like you wanted to see what happened in the sandbox. Maybe it's enough to just give players the option and make it a very viable and also satisfying option. Throw in enough numbers going up or particles, or make that game juice feel. If you make the pacifist side enjoyable, maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
I like
I think
the,
it's really interesting because I mentioned earlier, like in games where you kind of you get where you overtake another country or something, that stops existing as an entity, and that is kind of what you're solving with that, right? As you keep those entities kind of present in the game, and that way there's still some kind of potential there. There's still some gameplay interest. And I think that's really interesting. That's a really cool aspect. And that is definitely something that that makes it way more rich. And I think I had to think about a game of Ringworld that I played, where I kind of got a little emotionally attached to an enemy that I downed and then kind of saved off the field, because I thought he was already dead, but then I realized, oh, he's still alive, and I can leave him out there. And that's really interesting, because like we as humans, we're very empathetic, and when you have a game that kind of allows that to happen, then that is definitely a way. And I think it's really interesting that you're kind of experimenting with that, or having that in your game. It's
Yeah.
really cool.
I was just gonna say, like, I think that there's a very distinct difference between, 4X grand strategy and then these like on the ground type games where, like, first person shooters, for example, like, without a doubt, in any FPS RPG, any of that type of thing, if there's an option to be a nice guy, I'm a nice guy. Like, I'm never going to be mean to an NPC. I'll think about being mean to an NPC for the next 3 days, and I'll beat myself up about it. And so I think it's really interesting that, like, we have this empathy at a person level where you're willing to go out and save someone that you've, like, killed. It's your fault that they're there. And so you feel this kind of empathetic obligation to them to help them. But at this grand level, you just kind of lose sight of all of the micro interactions. So I wonder if maybe the solution is as simple as giving those micro interactions to the grand strategy and bringing them between perspectives.
absolutely. I think some of the games that tell a story, your story, like Victoria 3 or Victoria, any of them, Crusader Kings. And I think you could turn off combat in RimWorld if you really wanted to. It's certainly available through mods if you can't just choose a storyteller. I think those type of games are, a pacifistic run in those. Very, very viable. Very, very fun. I mean, you don't have to go to war in Crusader Kings.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah, yeah. Just to follow up on what Mario was saying, the idea of giving a face to the enemy, I really, really, really like that. I mean, if you think about the best villains, they're the ones that aren't, obviously evil. They have their backstory, they're human, and they were driven to their position through understandable, circumstances and decisions, and maybe, a villain you can sympathize with. I think is to me like the most powerful kind of, those are kind of the villains that I really, really like. And I don't mean to, talk about my game, but honestly, that's all I've been doing for the last 2 years. So that's my only reference point. But the idea of when I started developing it, I created, like basic in programming, I created my basic classes for a human, for a robot, so on and forth. And I ended up using the same parent class for both enemy units as well as ally units. And the parent class, it identifies everything about that human being. It creates their name, their backstory, their personality. And so actually all of my enemies on the back end, they have their names, and even the face generator works on the enemies too. And there's this nice little unexpected effect. Once I started capturing them instead of killing them, I created an interface so you could see who you captured. And so you go through and then you see, oh, this person, it takes place on Mars, but you can see, oh, they're from, Argentina or something. Oh, good thing I didn't kill them, right? They're into this and that, sports and skateboarding. Oh, like it was just an accident because again, I used the same kind of parent class that kept all that data together. But that ended up being like one of the best accidents that I found during the development, giving all of those prisoners and my enemies a face, a name, a personality. And when I'm out in combat too, it kind of also makes me think maybe I shouldn't kill them, And if I can just deliver a little bit of that even to some of the players, I'll be really, really satisfied in promoting it
I think
non-violent.
non-lethal force is a good way to go on some of these things. That really adds a new dimension to the game. I'm pleased you put that in.
Yeah, and what you said about the villains, I again had to think about Crusader Kings because I think that game is so complex that you actually sometimes understand how villains happen or somebody that would kind of feel like a villain because you can kind of see the mechanics, right? There's so much stuff happening to this one person, and then they get kind of turned into somebody who acts very evil in the game world, but there's actually reasons behind it, and I think that makes it so much more interesting. I think that's that's definitely, I feel like, kind of like what we're kind of getting down to, right? Is this thing like you need that layer of human motivation or emotion, or that kind of our the part of our brain that kind of is looking for something to glom on, the empathy gets fed and has something to work with.
Shadows of Mordor, the Nemesis system. That might be interesting coming into a Crusader Kings or any type of those 4Xs I was talking about, where you're the shattered empire, or you're the empire in decline. They did a good job on that system, at least in the first one. And the second one, I don't know how they did. I didn't play it.
I feel like that kind of shows how little you actually have to do to kind of make it feel a lot more personal, because I mean they kind of they had these sequences, but it was a lot of that was kind of out of the box and kind of pre-recorded lines, that kind of stuff, but it suddenly it felt so much more meaningful, like when you encountered those orcs compared to kind of the run-of-the-mill enemies that you usually mow down. I think that's really interesting.
I think also, like, sometimes you just don't want pacifism. Like sometimes you really just want to nuke everybody. Sometimes you just want to be a virus that takes over. Like sometimes you just want to do some damage that's like not visceral or anything. It's just is what it is. And equally, sometimes you don't want to do any damage, and you again want to go to your like Stardew Valley and fix your uncle's farm and make it really nice and prosperous. And I think like a big part of game development is going to be knowing what your game creates, what kind of feelings it creates, knowing what satisfaction comes from what mechanics, and then feeding into that as much as possible. Like maybe you just want to play chess. You don't want to play like I watch the bishop get like cut down in front of me because they have a specific face. You know what I mean? Sometimes you just want to sit back and like completely debunk, especially with like the information that we're expected to retain and all of the knowledge and like this life where we just have so much at like our fingertips, every game we could ever think possible. Like sometimes you just want something so simple, so arbitrary, that pacifism is like not even a thought in your head because you're not like in a war mindset, you're just in a head empty mindset.
I don't see a AAA studio doing a pacifistic strategy game, except for what we see in Civ, and I'm sure Civ 7 will enhance those features, but like I said earlier, people are going to min-max it. So it's up to the indies. And is it worth an indie betting his career on his game because, margins are slim? Do you want to take that risk?
Yeah, I think the risk only becomes manageable if you make it, if you kind of crack a mechanic to make it really satisfying. I was thinking about like the saying, like throwing a wrench into the machine, kind of maybe there's something there because we've been talking about a lot about pacifism as kind of a counter reaction to oppression or to violence. So maybe there's something there, right? Maybe there's something where you can kind of it's a bit like Angry Birds. Maybe kind of you have to find the weak spots in the machinery of oppression or violence and kind of find the way where you can kind of put in a lever to kind of make it crumble in a non-violent way or least violent way, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, has anybody played Spiritfarer?
It's
more of a cozy game. It's
I haven't
basically
finished it, but yeah.
Yeah, the premise is that you are the steward of death, basically. But it's very nice. It's very like visually very appealing. The mechanics are really nice. You're just building your boat up, and you're basically taking these people all the way, through their memories, and then passing them as they go through and experience that and go through their memories and their feelings and what's happened to them in their life. And you're with them as they process that, and then with them as they take their final steps to final death. I think like now that we've got to this level of the conversation, that kind of might be what ultimate pacifism is. Like there's no violence, there's no conflict. It's just helping people reach point A to point B in a very passive way.
In more narrative games, I see that as certainly being possible. I'm looking at all the games for Ludo Narracon, which is starts on the 4th, and I would say 80% of them have no type of conflict in them.
Yeah. I mean, is there a market? Just following up on what Seth said, is there a market? How difficult would it be to make such a game? I tell you, if you can pull it off, if you can get the mechanics right, you'll certainly get a lot of very good press. You'll stand out, and the amazing thing about indies is that just the gaming market in general is just how big it is and just how accessible it is. This is my first game, my commercial game that I'm making, but I also thought about being an author before. I kind of tried, and man, like there's so much money in games. There's so many publishers, there's so many players, and more importantly, there's this like culture of wanting to support games, like from the consumer's perspective. I'm okay to pay money. There's people don't want to pay for articles. I'm sorry, to all the journalists, that mindset is just gone. They want it free. But for games, it's like it's still okay. And so
I don't think it's okay, and I'm a journalist.
I know. I said I'm sorry. Seth. That is I used to be a journalist too, actually, so I know very well how painful it is. And in fact, just kind of echoing on that, I found it difficult to tell some stories through articles, which is why I went and tried to do game dev. I thought that the interactivity of games as a medium is really, really good for telling complicated stories and maybe longer stories. And a big plus is the fact that there's this giant market that exists to support that activity.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's like loyalty, right, to brand. There's an insane amount of loyalty, especially to indie brands. Like if you make a good game and you keep making good games, people are just going to keep following you and buy you no matter what you do because they like love what you do.
Yeah,
Well, I have a big thing that I believe in, and I'm having trouble convincing a lot of publishers. It's the publisher's job at the end of the day to ensure that the game comes out in the best state possible, so that follow-up games, it'll build a following. It'll build a friendly following for follow-up games, whether it's with that publisher or with that developer. But it seems like the publishers want the developers to handle their own QA and outreach and playtesting. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but that's for another topic. You triggered that that brain snap.
That pain point, yeah.
Yeah. Are you listening?
Yeah. 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 I mean, the dynamics of what the publishers want, I have a lot of opinions on that as well. Maybe for another topic. But yeah, I think definitely the next game jam that I take part in, I will focus on this. I will remember this. I promise. The next game jam I make will be about pacifism.
Well, you better tell at least me or tell us about it.
I will.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also a really good point about the passion that people have for games. I think that is really something like I was in the mobile game space before, and it's such a different beast because people just don't care about those at all. In most cases, rightfully so, I'd say. And it's such a different beast. Like even now with our game, which is still fairly small and it's not out yet. Like we have a community, and you kind of see people actually like caring about the game and then kind of being engaged with it. And I think that is really encouraging. I think that there's definitely space to explore all kinds of things, like all the things that we talked about. Like I wouldn't be shocked if somebody's working on it somewhere and was kind of like, oh no, they're talking about my idea. because there's just so much going on, and there's so many smart people kind of exploring all different avenues, right? Like some people are kind of complaining about games. I think games have never been better and stronger than today, because there's just so much room for all kinds of different takes on genres and ideas, and kind of mixing everything together. And there's a community of players who's willing to engage with so many different things, which I think is really, really cool. Like I keep being surprised by sometimes what kind of takes off, and it's not always the big flashy things. Like I think there's really cool interesting success. I don't like Dwarf Fortress. I know what a crazy story that is. Like and it's so cool. Like how long that could have been going on, and everybody's just so happy for the guys that they're finally making money off their game, which they've been supporting for such a long time. And I think that's just it's such a nice, like I feel it's a very, very nice community to be part of. Like there's definitely the dark underbelly of that as well. Like I'm sure we're all familiar with that, but like in general, it's a very, very cool space to be working in, and definitely one that like if somebody will kind of explore these ideas, it's definitely the indie game space.
You mentioned Against the Storm when we were setting up.
Yeah.
Has everybody played it?
I only played the demo for a bit. I haven't really gotten to it.
Fantastic game, and they're leaving combat out of it. It's a great city builder. It's also got some 4X roguelite, where you gain some sort of meta progression. Really interesting concept, and I think there's tons of room for that. I mean, obviously, city builders are strategy in most cases. Either that or they're painters. I think City Skylines became a painter, where there's really no strategy in it except for traffic management.
Yeah.
But something like Timberborn as well. There's your conflict is the rising water and damming the bridges or damming the Terra Nil. It's a reverse city builder. You tear down the damage that the city or the technology caused.
Yeah. I think the city builder space in general has been really like also kind of echoing that sentiment of there's definitely satisfaction in building stuff as well, or even maybe something like Minecraft, right? Which is the kind of the biggest game in the world, I guess. Still, is kind of mostly about building stuff. Of course, there's a survival aspect, but that's not how most kids that are playing the game are engaging with it. Like it's about creativity, and I think that is the city builder space is very has very similar taste in that regard.
When I played Minecraft, I would load in mods that had super progression, like stuff like nuclear, or various forms of power. These big mod packs that didn't really go into building things, but went into gaining technology from rocks to iron to copper to iron, and the different tools along the way until you go to space. I think people get a lot of satisfaction in progression games.
Yeah.
Taking some of have you guys played a lot of idle games?
Way more than I'd like to admit, yeah.
Me too. But I think some of I've spent more than I'd like to admit in some of the gotcha games. But I think some of the progression systems in an idle game where you would unlock various things, I think that would keep the player motivated in say a peaceful game.
Yeah. I think idle games are really interesting because I feel like they had a huge impact on the gaming landscape in a way that a lot of people maybe don't really notice, like all the survivor like games like Vampire Survivor, that wave of games. Like I feel it feels so similar to me in terms of just the loop that you go through. Like with this, you start and it feels very heavy in the beginning and not very satisfying, and then you kind of make the first little iterations of your loops and you unlock the stuff, and then it that the way that the first couple of minutes go by so quickly, like when you re-roll in Cookie Clicker, and it feels so amazing, like when you remember the hard time that you had actually manually clicking through, and then it's just everything just goes by so quickly. And there's definitely there's a lot of ways, and that is a non-conflict game. Like even if you get the evil grandma sometimes, you don't fight them necessarily. And so there's definitely mechanics that you can, and the builder genre definitely is I think the preeminent example of that, right? Like people want to build something, it's really enjoyable, like, or the gardening, like Stardew Valley, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
But even in Stardew, there's conflict. You go down into the mines, you fight oozes.
But I'd say it's not the main focus of
no, not at
the
all.
game, and not the main point of satisfaction.
Could you skip it?
I'm not sure.
I think there's a certain resource that you need that's down there. I haven't played that much Stardew, but I know that you go to the mines to get some kind of like iron ingot thing. Maybe you could buy it though.
Is there conflict in oxygen not included?
I don't know.
I think there is. I've never played it though. I've only watched some streams.
So I mean, some of those builders can certainly be conflict free, or there's an enemy in the background that maybe you never see. It's an existential threat, like starving. I mean, that's certainly something that could be exploited on or explored upon, not exploited.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Seth.
I just keep coming down to the thought that is it going to be financially viable for the industry to move in a direction towards this? I mean, there's been 6 civilizations so far, and war is the biggest way of winning. Same thing with Humankind, same thing with Stellaris. So all of these games are heavy war. They must.
I mean, like, thinking about it in terms of whether it's going to be like profitable slash financially viable is kind of like not keeping in mind that trends move, trends adjust. People want decidedly different things than what they want for the last 6 years. Maybe the next 6 years are going to be inherently just like not focused on civ-like mechanics at all. And maybe we aren't even able to materialize the type of game that's going to come out in 6 years' time because it's just so far left of maybe what we had originally thought pacifism would look like in games. You know what I mean?
Well, I think you've got a good point there that we've changed as a global community.
I think if you had said like 15 years ago, you know, oh, there's some games out here where you just hose down a house, people would be like, what? How is that? Even if you said like 2 years ago, yeah, one of the most popular games, yeah, it's like people would just be completely shocked. But it's just how people have evolved, what people want from games changes.
Yeah, I think what what I'll be really interested in is seeing the new AI technology, kind of if that makes their way into games, because I think like what we talked about before, kind of triggering that empathetic side of humans. I think if you get like NPCs or something in a game, or even adversaries in a strategy game or something that act a lot more human, and they that feel more like they're actually having motivations, that kind of stuff, I think that would open a door to a lot more mechanical exploration of that space as well. And I think that will be really, really interesting, because like definitely like I've been working with ChatGPT quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, and it's very, very hard not to kind of humanize that. Like I definitely say thanks.
Say please and thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Can you
I
please?
find that really I find that really interesting, because I feel like that is a very common experience with people who use these tools, and I think there is something there. Like, and I feel like the like if we talk in 5 years, 10 years, it's only a matter of scaling that technology to where it gets to a point where the reaction times are so quickly that you could actually use that in a game. And I think then we're suddenly talking about things that are way beyond what we could have imagined like a couple of years ago in terms of interactivity, and that then opens you know, if you, I don't know, if you have like hundreds of those GPT agents that kind of react towards what you're doing, and they get told, hey, this and that happened, and then you suddenly have an actual kind of systemic reaction towards that, then I think that could make these topics a lot more viable and a lot more kind of mechanically kind of pliable in a way, you know, where you could actually put it into a game in a way that would have been impossible before that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been like a lot of focus on games having AI that is like aggressive, that's competitive, that's like really focused on winning. So I think it's really interesting with the rise of ChatGPT. Like, if you had said again 5 years ago, yeah, we have AI in the games that, you know, could give an empathetic reaction as an NPC, people would be like, AI is like evil. What do you mean? AI is going to take over the world and kill us all. But now it's like with the rise of ChatGPT, we're kind of like, wow, AI is actually a tool. You know, it's something that we use to improve the experience. And I'm reading a book now. It's called Scythe. Has anybody read Scythe?
I know
it's basically
game.
Like, yeah, I don't know if they're similar, but it's this like AI is this entity that is beyond helpful. It's created this utopia of a world, and to the point where it can preemptively kind of decide what you might need at what point, and like make decisions that help you in your everyday life, to the point where now there's like no need. And I guess that's taken it all the way to the point of the extent of the utopia. Like, what do you do when everything's solved? But just considering that, you know, AI can be this tool instead of this like inhibiting force that's going to stop you from winning, I think it's really interesting.
I think the technology for GPT is going to rapidly change everything. And I don't think it's going to be 5-10 years. I think it's going to be next year. You know, we're going to be amazed at what this thing can do. Galactic Civilizations 4, the new one, the Supernova version of it, they have a thing where you can create your opponents using GPT. So you say, I want an elven race of mystics or whatever. That's just what came to my mind. And it will generate an image, it will generate text, it will generate story, it will generate abilities, and you just plug that into the game. This is brilliant.
Yeah.
I think what Mario said was just so on point about pacifism and also humanizing a lot of the enemies.
Yeah.
I really love what he said there. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just agreed. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm already thinking, you mentioned this, Mario, also, but the delay is quite significant right now. Probably at best get 10-second lag between an input and output. But for a strategy game, especially a real-time one, 4x turn-based, actually you could preload a lot of that. I'm already thinking like, okay, actually you could make a lot of this happen even with the current limitations. So I agree, Seth. I think we will see pretty cool innovation.
I also think like it will be like the implication of that will be they're already being felt. Like IBM just stopped hiring like for thousands of positions because they said they will be able to do those with AI, and the ramifications of that are far beyond the scope of that panel. But I just think, in terms of just game mechanics, I think that is it'll be really exciting, and it's mostly a problem of interface, I guess, at the moment, right? It's just how do you plug that into a game and kind of make it talk to the other mechanics in your game. But I think these are all very solvable problems, and will be probably have been in some bedroom somewhere. I guess there's a lot of stuff going on, or like you said,
some garage, some basement.
or like you said with the Galactic Civilizations, like it's already being used in really cool ways. And there's definitely downsides to it, but I have to admit that I'm really optimistic about it at the moment, and like especially in terms of game development and also kind of putting those into games. I feel like there's like such an interesting space opening up there that just like I said before, it's completely crazy how quickly that has suddenly turned on and became a possibility that just was not there before, and like if you put that in a game, I don't like Frostpunk, I kept thinking about like if you have those little numbers that people are represented by, if you make those talk to a GPT agent and kind of, hey, your needs are not being met here, what does that mean to you? And your husband is freezing, and suddenly kind of and again, I'm humanizing because I already feel, oh man, how must that GPT agent feel if that is the only thing that it will experience? But I think it's really, really interesting.
So we're at about an hour 15. Let's take the next 15 minutes like wrapping up. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure.
And we can go longer if you want.
I mean, I'm really tired.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to lose.
We'll wrap in 15.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So how do we want to wrap this up? I mean, I don't want to design a game right now with you guys, form a company and publish it real quick. I happen to know a publisher who might be sponsoring this.
Call it Pacifism Incorporated.
I don't know. Ken, what do you think? How do you want to wrap this up?
Was that me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of covered off on all of the realms of possibilities that I could think would be associated with pacifism, right? So we've like gone to the mech, like the high level, we've gone all the way down to the minutia. We've looked at it from this angle, from the angle of the aggressor, from the angle of the victim, from the angle of, I guess, every which way about it. So I think, ultimately there has to be conflict. There's always going to be conflict with, like, however many billion people are on the planet. There's always going to be people that don't agree. And so using these games that focus on pacifism as tools to kind of educate, especially like the youth who are so used to this really visceral first-person shooter, kill, win, come out, do it again and again and again, through interesting game mechanics that are also going to give them that satisfaction, but aren't like putting killing and death and explosions on this pedestal. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge that game design, especially with pacifism, faces. How I want to wrap this up, I think we've already wrapped it. I think it's all like kind of come together nicely.
I don't know if you guys covered it, but did you talk much about your games and like elements of pacifism and non-aggression in your games?
A little bit.
Did you
Yeah,
not?
we did a little bit. We can refocus on that. That would be cool.
I find like my first
Yeah,
thought.
definitely. I definitely. So our game is a roguelike real-time strategy game, and I've definitely thought about kind of ways where we could make a non-violent run possible, kind of having maybe units or skills that allow you to, I don't know, maybe buy up the enemy base or stuff like that in very certain conditions. I feel like it's really, really challenging to put in a game like ours because these kinds of builds could become dead ends very quickly, where if you don't have the right components, like it either has to be super powerful right from the get-go, or it just is very, very hard to make viable. So I've kind of shied away from actually exploring that further so far. But I definitely thought about it because I think like it would be cool because our game is so malleable in terms of player, like in terms of how you play it, that yeah, it's definitely still in the back of my mind. Like I think there could be some cool stuff where you like also all the entities in our levels are interactive, so there's very few of them, but all the plants and animals and everything is kind of inheriting from the same base classes, so you kind of really can engage with them. So maybe there'll be ways where you can kind of use the environment or use the level in a way that to overcome the challenge instead of kind of blowing up the enemy base. But I think that is definitely the default, will be the default in our game for sure. But yeah, I've been thinking a lot about like builder type games, like maybe for our next game we'll go more into that direction.
What is it that Sun Tzu said? Like, the best type of victory is the one where the opponent doesn't even fight. So maybe, I don't know, maybe as a reference, I had The Art of War out just because I was moving books around in my office. So I happened to flick open to that. So maybe as like a good reference point for any kind of a game that focuses on conflict as a heavy part of what they're doing, it could be good to reference kind of old material like, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which explores like, how a focus isn't always on the actual fight itself. Like 90% of the conflict is everything else. Like whether the general's strong, whether the nation is strong, whether they're well armed, whether they're happy, whether the terrain is favorable, whether the weather's favorable, like all of these other elements that aren't necessarily just killing. So yeah, might be helpful.
Machiavelli might be good too.
Yeah, the prince.
Got that back there too?
We're also working on 2 games here at Log. We're working on Solium Infernum, which is this kind of grand strategy. You're in hell, the Dark Majesties disappeared, and you're basically an archfiend, so you're this like really, really powerful entity, kind of like at the level of, I guess, like Julius Caesar or any of the kind of Civ related things, and you are venturing out to conquer the throne, and doing so is not as easy as just rolling up to the main tower and being like, what's up, I'm here. You have to navigate this kind of social climate of hell, conquer places of power, engage in diplomacy with other archfiends, and because of like allegiances, because of like bureaucratic reasons, you can't just rock up and kill other people. There's forced diplomacy as part of the game structure itself, that make you go through and understand strategically do you want to enter conflict in the first like 10 turns? Like, is that really the smartest thing you want to do? Because at that point, they can reach out to allies and, you know, they can force against you. And it's just an interesting kind of social dynamic that it creates. We're also working on Jumplight Odyssey, which I've already talked about, so I won't reiterate. Roguelike ship out. But yeah, that's what we discussed in the earlier bits.
Yuji?
Yeah, I think I've talked quite a bit about my game already, so I won't repeat myself. But the idea of non-violence was kind of there from the beginning. I mean, my game is kind of different in the sense that it's humans fighting humans, and especially you can play as both the company and the workers. And from the company's perspective, you don't really want to kill your workers; they're your resource. So from the beginning, the idea of non-violence was a big thing. But then, you know, the war in Ukraine really did make me reflect quite a bit. I think when Nintendo delayed Advanced Wars, everyone like indefinitely, right? I was like, oh, was that really necessary? But actually, yes, it definitely was necessary, and as throughout the development, as I kept creating like violent scenes, it did somewhere within me it kept like a voice was talking to me. For example, at the my publisher kept talking about we need airstrikes and we need vehicles, and so I created, you know, like these massive explosions and bodies flying. And I posted on social media, part of me was like, damn it, what am I doing? And so that reinforced within me a drive to look for more non-violent kind of, you know, avenues for the player to explore. And I'm really happy at where we arrived. So it's, you know, a tactical game where killing is not the end goal. But overall, I love this panel. I love the topic, and I think we're talking about something that will be a bigger thing over the coming years. So I think it's really, really timely, and I think it was a really good discussion.
Yeah, yeah. It really feels like the time's very good for that. Like in terms of like the player needs, and like with the cozy games and the builder games, and then also the political climate. And then that new technological possibilities. Yeah, there's really feels like there's a door opening up for really interesting pacifist games.
I certainly am planning on keeping you guys in touch, or keeping in touch with you guys, because I've really enjoyed this panel, and we do some podcasting as well with another group, and Game Wisdom might try to convince you to come in with that. And of course, I've got, you know, the Strategy Informer, and we do dev interviews.
Sure.
You know, I never really mentioned what I did in development other than Terminal Conflict. I came into the industry with the MMOs, Ultima Online, Turbine's Asheron's Call, and a little bit of Lord of the Rings online. So it was an interesting time. I mean, that was back, you know, 2000. And I ran my own company in 2010, which did basically, we were aping Mafia Wars and Facebook games, and we were integrating gambling into it. This was pre-mobile, or pre-mobile games of the type. So it was an interesting time. But yeah, when Terminal Conflict, when the Ukraine war happened, it really shook us in Terminal Conflict. And I'm a big war gamer as well. Both in the computer and on the tabletop. I've been playing since I was 13. Just absolutely, you know, seeing a conflict, it made me think about the games that I was playing, and was I glorifying conflict before I saw it? So I think pacifism in games sounds really interesting, and conflict resolution. What would a game look like if you were trying to get a peace deal signed with country A and country B? I don't know. Food for thought.
Yeah.
Totally.
We will be the ones to create it, maybe. You know, let's stay in touch.
Absolutely.
What's that game?
We have
called where you play
developers.
like the prime minister of a. No, whatever.
Again, I really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Yeah, for sure. It was
It's been
really fun.
awesome,
It was worth getting up at 2 in the night for this.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's
Thank you
fine.
for doing that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
so
great. I'm really happy you could join us, Yuji. It was definitely nice
Yeah.
to have you
Yeah,
on.
And
that
thank you
was
for
great.
hosting, Seth, as well. It's awesome.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting, Seth. You definitely kept us on track.
Yeah.
That
Great
was,
job moderating.
that was the hope. I didn't screw it up.
No,
All
we didn't.
right. For TactiCon Games, for us, we've been us, you've been you. Talk to you later.